Okay guys, welcome to class. As you know, I'm still out of the country, but today we will learn about India's Sepoy Mutiny. Now, you need to take Cornell notes on this, so 3 questions, a summary sentence, and the most important facts and information. Let's begin. Now, as we've talked about, India once had a great empire called the Mughal Empire. Remember Akbar and the Taj Mahal. Well, eventually this empire starts to decline, and it declines at the wrong time. This happens just as the Europeans are starting to explore and looking to trade. All sorts of countries will come to India: the British, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French. And as we know, they are working with their joint stock companies. A lot of East India companies will operate in India. Now, eventually, the Portuguese and the Dutch decide to trade in other places, so it leaves England and France to compete over control of India. Now, as we know, England and France will fight a world war called the 7 Years' War. It's also called the Great War for Empire, which is one of the most accurate war names in history. They're basically competing all over the globe to have control of trade. They're fighting in North America. So remember, this happened before the American Revolution. They're fighting in Europe. And they're obviously fighting in India. Now, the English win in India thanks to the leadership of General Robert Clive, who won the Battle of Plassey in 1757. However, he wasn't all that heroic. He actually made an alliance with France's allies to not show up to the battle. So basically, he bought his way to victory. And then after he won, then he didn't even give France's former allies what he promised them. So he really used an underhanded tactic to win. Now this is a good map right here, and this is about 100 years after Robert Clive won the Battle of Plassey. And it shows you just how, even though the British have control in India, it's not unified at all. India doesn't have a history of unity. If you look here in the dark gray, you can see areas that are controlled by England. However, the light gray are territories that they don't control. These are still controlled by native Indians. So as we said, East India companies are operating out of this territory. Remember, these are joint stock companies, and their goal is to gather precious raw materials and natural resources and send them back to Europe. Now, the British East India Company is the most dominant. And this British East India Company officially operates the colony. They really extend their power gradually. Early on, they are just collecting taxes for the declining Mughal Empire. So this is a way that they are really getting their foot in the door. However, over time, they start winning control over more and more land. And they even passed this law that says that if someone owes taxes at the time of their death, then their property, their land, goes to the British East India Company. So by doing this, they start to really extend their power gradually, but very effectively. Then, as we know, they will export cheap Indian cotton to England for manufacture. Something to remember also, later this chapter, they also export opium, an addictive drug, to China. So just remember that. And as we talked about last chapter with the factory system, this cotton will be manufactured in England into clothing, and then it will be sold back into India, as we said, for much less than the competition. And then obviously the byproduct of all this is that the English culture becomes more and more dominant in India. You can see this English culture in the form of architecture in 2 examples. And this is the first, the Parliament House in Delhi. So this is where the British will actually set up some form of parliament for their colony. And if you look, this has a colonnade in it. It looks like something that you would find back in England somewhere. It obviously has Greek influences. This does not look very Indian in its architecture. Pretty flowers though, right? And even more over the top is the Victoria Memorial in Calcutta, or as it's called before the British got there, and it's called once again today, Kolkata. If you look, this is a marble memorial for one person, the Queen of England, Queen Victoria, who also at the end of her life had the title the Empress of India. And you can see just how over the top this is. This looks very European. If I showed you this and asked you where you were, my guess is you wouldn't say India. So it really shows you just how British India is becoming. Now, this is a good slide just to see how the British are living in India. And as you can see, you have servants here in the Indians, and this is a British colonial officer who is basically being fanned, and his feet are being attended to, maybe some type of massage by one of these natives. So it really shows you how the British are going in, and they're using India for their own good. Now, as we talked about in class, the British choose an indirect ruling policy rather than a direct ruling policy because this is cheaper, and they would rather have local Indian rulers called Rajas rule for them. They will employ tax collectors called zamindars to collect taxes for them. And as you can imagine, the zamindars owe money to the British. So if you can't pay your zamindar, then you lose your property to the British. If the zamindar can't pay you, the zamindar loses his property to the British. So this is a scheme for the British to continue gaining more and more land in India. And then local soldiers called sepoys will be used to fill up most of England's colonial army in India. Remember, we said this is cheaper than employing an army of all British soldiers. You can pay the sepoys probably a fourth of what you would pay a British soldier, and this is a way to save money. You would have English officers in the army to keep order and to command the sepoys, however. Now, this is a good painting of what the sepoys looked like. Okay, they're wearing turbans, however, they're still wearing British colonial uniforms. It's really not a bad job if you think about it. You get status, you get power, you get employment, so you get money. However, you could be seen as a bit of a sellout in that you are keeping order for a foreign country who has conquered your land. For as nice as all this is for England, things eventually start to go badly. Okay, and as we said, this colony is not run by England, it's run by the British East India Company, and their goal is to, that's right, be efficient and make money. So the idea of cultural awareness or cultural protection is the last thing on their minds. As I've written right here, it's not uncommon for the company to knock down Muslim mosques and Hindu temples if it came to building wider roads or putting down railroad lines or putting up telegraph lines. So it really is culturally insensitive to do these things. As I just mentioned, all these modern things that are built in India, like telegraph wires, kind of the early version of a telephone, and railroads, sound great. They make India more modern, but they also make England more powerful, and they allows them to rule India more effectively. And lastly, you have these things called home charges. These are the profits made off of India. So when the company makes money off of the Indian people and off of Indian natural resources, this is the profit, and they get to choose how to spend the profit. Basically, it sort of speaks of social Darwinism, that the English are wiser and more civilized, and they know how to spend their money, spend India's money. This would be like your parents taking some type of money that you win in a contest, and instead of letting you go out and buy Beats by Dre, they instead will spend the money for you because you cannot spend it well yourself. They are wiser than you, okay? So just as you would be upset with that, the Indians were upset, but on a much larger scale. Now, as all things go, there's a tipping point, okay? There's all this bad blood that's starting to boil over from India to the English. However, it really starts to get bad in 1853. There's a new efficient rifle called the Lee Enfield rifle. It's a repeating rifle. This means that it can be reloaded much faster than earlier models, okay? If it's efficient, remember, it's less costly and has more production. So in this case, it takes less time to reload, and it's obviously fires more often per minute. The reason why it's more efficient is that it has everything that it needs to fire in one convenient paper cartridge. You have the bullet inside the cartridge. You have the wadding, okay, you have to stuff this down the gun's muzzle with the bullet. You obviously need gunpowder, so it has gunpowder inside. And all of this needs to be kept waterproof, and so they do that using melted down cow or pig fat. Now, why is this offensive to sepoys? Wait for it. Now, as you can see in this photograph, you obviously have to bite the cartridge to release all of these things. So you would bite it, and then you would pour the gunpowder down the muzzle, as you see in photograph 2. And then you would stuff everything down with a ramrod in the third diagram. And then you would fire it. Okay, it seems fine. However, this is wildly offensive to sepoys who are Muslims and Hindus, because if they're biting into something that is made with cow fat or pig fat, then you are religiously defiling them. So, Mr. Duncan, what does it look like to fire one of these rifles? Well, kids, I'll show you.
Fire in the hole!
Now, as I said, the fact here that you are biting into something like cow fat, that can hurt your status in whatever caste you are if you're a Hindu. So if you are in the Kshatriya class, maybe this is going to knock you down a few notches to maybe something like a Shudra, okay? So this is hurting your status overall. If you're a Muslim, it's considered unclean to eat pork. So the British, in doing this, they've really made the sepoys angry. And there's even a rumor that it's not even cow or pig fat, it's actually beeswax. But the British have such a history of being culturally insensitive, the sepoys just assume that it's the worst. And so in Meerut, the city north of Delhi, the sepoys are charged with, in this big military sort of parade, to fire this new weapon with a new cartridge. Well, guess what, guys? They refused to do it. In this ceremony where everyone's watching and then they protest by not biting into the cartridge, they have chosen to maintain their religious rank and their culture over their obedience to England, okay? And as punishment of this, they are publicly humiliated, they are stripped of their uniforms, and they're sentenced to 10 years of hard labor. These are guys who are keeping order for England in India, yet now they are criminals. The next day, which happened to be a Sunday, the remaining sepoys in the city of Meerut took matters into their own hands. Dun, dun, dun. So these sepoys that are still in the city of Meerut decide to rise up and lead a mutiny. A mutiny is a word that basically means when you fight back against your leadership. Okay, it's usually seen more on a boat, okay, with like a ship captain, and the sailors will mutiny against the captain. Well, in this case, it's the sepoys who fight back against their bosses, the British, okay, the colonial administrators of India. You'll read a document after this that is from the perspective of a British woman who is living in Meerut at the time, and it really just describes the horror of these native soldiers who start a rebellion. So it's really scary. Now you can see this map, if you look carefully, focus on the black areas, okay? These are the states that are in rebellion. And the number one, and I'll circle it right now, this is Meerut, so it's north of Delhi, and this is where the rebellion starts. And as you can see, it spreads. And it doesn't spread all over India. It spreads just to a few key cities, okay? Cities like, starting in Meerut, and then going to places like Delhi and Kanpur and Lucknow, sort of key Indian cities. Now, as they defeat the British in Meerut, on the way out, the sepoys cut the telegraph lines, like the telephone lines. There's a symbolic meaning of this, and there's a literal meaning of this. Why did they do this symbolically, and why do they do this literally? And as I said, this inspired other cities like Delhi and Lucknow and Kanpur to rise up and revolt. But this is also one of the reasons why this whole revolt failed. Can you guess why? The guy I feel sorry for is Bahadur Shah, who's technically the Mughal emperor. And he's on the British payroll. They pay him a lot of money every year just to keep Delhi in order. Okay, this is sort of their local indirect ruler of Delhi. And the Sepoy rebels come to Delhi and say, "You're leading us in this rebellion." And he can't really say no, he can't be a sellout, so he joins the cause, even though he knows that in the end they will fail and that he will be killed for it. And all of this comes true. Now, the British were totally shocked by this event. They didn't see this at all. They saw this as a conspiracy. And they had this crazy sort of conspiracy theory that the Indians were just being ungrateful, and that this was part of like a secret group, a secret order of rebels who sent around their message on this unleavened bread called chapati, kind of like naan. And this was just sort of a secret ploy to become free. They didn't see this at all. They were totally out of touch with how unhappy the Indians were. And their reply was called pacification. Now, usually pacification means when you calm someone down peacefully, like if you pacify a crying child, okay? You may give it a pacifier, right, which is why it's called that, or you could rock the child or rock the baby, sing it a song, and it will stop crying. Well, in this case, it sounded good, but in reality, pacification was just the most brutal murder you can ever imagine. The British want to make an example out of India because they don't want their other colonies to rise up in rebellion as well. And so they targeted the cities that had rebelled and come in and do just the most horrible things with the people who they capture. And this is a drawing, so this actually happened. This could be considered a primary source. And this is a rebel who was captured and has been tied to a cannon. And as you can see, the cannon is about to be fired. Now, this has to do with a Hindu sort of superstition, a Hindu religious belief that if the body is destroyed, if it's blown up, if the body is not intact, then there's no way for successful reincarnation to occur. So this is definitely not only hurting this man physically, it's hurting him spiritually as well. So it really shows that the British are capable of doing very cruel things in order to reassert dominance and control. Now, why did this mutiny fail? Well, we can criticize it by not having a lot of nationalism. It's not very unified. But that's sort of an unfair criticism. Now, as I said earlier, India has very little history of being unified back through its history. And plus, nationalism is a European concept. It's not an Indian concept, and it's still a concept that's fairly young. India has different cultures, different languages, different religions, different regions, okay, different concepts, different beliefs. So as you even saw in the map at the beginning, it's not unified even under the British, okay? There's a history of local rule and local culture. Now, as I said earlier, this rebellion that's starting in Meerut would inspire city revolts in places like Delhi and Kanpur and Lucknow. But then when the sepoys from those cities freed their city, they would stop fighting because their mission was accomplished. This made it easier for England to come in and one by one pick off each city and reassert control. Now for the big picture, what changed in India? Do they still have sepoys? Absolutely. They just have more British soldiers to try to keep better order. Another big change is the British East India Company loses its power in India. Now India becomes an official British crown colony. So the colony will be led by a viceroy. This is a person in India who is basically like the governor of India. And he is doing things to try to prevent another rebellion. So things that the company was guilty of, he's trying to turn around and stop. So he's trying to promote religious awareness. So he's trying to cut down on religious conversion to Christianity. He's stopping all of the land grabs that happen under the company. And then he's also doing things like giving Indians, very slowly, but giving them more representation in local government. Now, as I said earlier, eventually the king or queen of England will become the leader of India, and Victoria adds Empress of India to her list of titles really at the end of her career. And they showed their power and dominance in India, England did, by holding these things called durbars. And these were like mega parades that had all of this music and all of these processions. They had elephants, they had fancy uniforms and costumes and entertainment, and it was really meant to show who was in charge, and that was England. So these will be some photographs of Delhi Durbars, and this first one is the Delhi Durbar of 1903. They had one in 1877 when Queen Victoria became Empress, but I don't have any pictures from that. This is from when the next king, called King Edward VII, became the King of England and the Emperor of India. So just take a look at this. Look at all the way going back to the horizon, how you have elephants that are really lined up in procession. They're wearing these fancy uniforms. You can see sepoys on horseback wearing British colonial uniforms. So again, this is a huge parade to show just how powerful the English, in this case, the King of England and the Emperor of India, really is. This is at the next big Durbar, and this is in 1911, and this is King George V. And you can see the uniform that he's wearing, and he's flanked by colonial servants. By the way, they call this the British Raj, and Raj, R-A-J, means rule. So this is the British rule of India. And this is the Durbar of 1911, the one where you saw the King George V. And you can barely see him in his platform here. And look at all of the soldiers you see, okay? You look at basically how many people are lined up in order to impress the King of England, now the Emperor of India. So I hope you've enjoyed this, but more importantly, I want you to read and soapstone the primary source document. Okay, this is the one I was telling you about of the English lady who was living in Meerut, and she describes the day that the mutiny began. Okay, I will see you very soon. Enjoy your day. Bye-bye.